So we're in lesson number 2, and this is working with buyers. And when I start this class, I like to ask a question: what kind of agent do you want to be? Have you given that any thought?
A little. It's more just trying to survive the first couple of years at the moment, but I think right now I'd like to be a seller's agent.
There you go. That's actually the right answer. This is a buyer's class, but I'm telling you right now, the kind of agent you want to be is a listing agent. Why is that? Because when you're the listing agent, of course, in a hot market where there's 30 offers, it's an easy answer that we don't have to ask the question. But this class is for all types of markets, and some markets are slower. Sometimes listings don't sell right away. But even in a slow market, listing agents are king or queen, and there's a lot of reasons for that. First of all, when you're a listing agent and you have a lot of listings, you can take the weekend off. While other agents go around and show those listings, and then you can just come back Sunday night and see what offers show up in your email. There's a lot of other reasons you can manage your time, but here's another thing. Let's suppose you like working with buyers. The best way to get the best buyer leads is the calls you get off of your own listings. Again, like I mentioned with mailings, your own successes are your best advertising. So being a strong listing agent, you can also be fussy about the buyers you meet. I can give you a really good example of that. In a marketplace, I think the year was 1996. It was one of my best years in the business. I think I did a little over $600,000 in commissions that year. And average sales price was around $300,000. And I was dominating a certain geographical farm and wasn't working with any buyers. In fact, the market was so tight back then in this particular snapshot in time that the only buyers I'd work with were past clients, sellers of my listings, or a personal friend, because I really had buyer leads just pouring in because of the amount of listings that I had at the time. So one day, the receptionist tells me that there's someone downstairs wants to meet with me. I didn't have an appointment, and I said, go ahead, send them on up. And this gentleman comes into my office, and he puts $5,000 in cash, $100 bills down on my desk. And he says, I've been trying to buy a house in this particular neighborhood, which was Westlake, California, in a city called Daly City. And he says, I just bought the business, which I didn't know. He had bought the corner market that was close by to my farm. And he said, I've been trying to move my family here, and I have to have a house. Every time a house pops up, it's usually your listing. I'm putting in offers. I just need you to find me a house. If you find me a house, you can keep the commission and keep the $5,000 cash. So I picked up the $5,000 cash and I handed it back to him, and I said, I'll find you a house. And the reason I'm telling that story is because I was a strong listing agent, here this AAA motivated buyer walked into my office, okay? Now, all that story aside, when you're a new agent, not always, sometimes an agent gets a license and they have several listing leads in the pipeline right when they get started, but most don't. And most listings take a matter of time, especially if it's a geographical farm that you plan to do. The whole idea of calling a farm is you plant seeds, you wait for them to grow. You don't have time to do that when you have bills to pay, unless you have a lot of money in the bank. Some people do, but most don't. And so a buyer usually is the shortest path to that first commission check. And there's all kinds of ways to generate buyer leads. Some of them might be passed down to you, handed down to you. Open houses on other people's listings is a great way for a new agent to generate buyers. It's also a great way to compete against the people that are spending mega money to have all the lead traffic sent to them, because they can't prevent some of these leads from finding your open house signs on the weekend. And that's another thing I would invest in with a new agent with a limited resource. I would buy open house signs with your name on it. I'll be happy to lend you mine, and you can advertise me on 4th Street corners all weekend. I'd be perfectly happy with that. Your broker too. Your broker would love to give you just company signs with the company phone number on it. No, get your own signs with your direct phone number on that. Because even if you do an open house for 3 hours and no one shows up, at least you had 4 billboards sitting out on the street while you were there. So that's a small investment that you should make right away. But there's lots of other ways to generate buyer leads by the same methods of prospecting. People talk about a lot of them. We talk about farming for listings, but if you're farming buyers, where are you going to find buyers? Buyers are renting. So prospecting apartment buildings, hanging doorknobs. In this very room, several years ago, I got together with a couple loan agents and we did a first-time buyer class in this room that was very successful. We sent out 4,000 mailings and we had a group of about 20 people that showed up. And out of those 20 people, I think I put 3 of them into contract. So for one night's work, there was 3 sales. And that was from prospecting. Those mails went directly to rental properties. So anyway, that's just another little prospecting tip. So when working with buyers, another big part of your team, we talked about this a little bit in lesson 1, is the loan agents that you work with. If you're working with really good, personable, good salespeople who are also loan agents, they're going to help you close your deals. A lot of times, if you refer them to somebody competent and professional, that locks them in. And over time, the communication between you and that loan agent makes your life a lot smoother. If you have somebody that you know is doing their job correctly, and they tell you, you know what, this person's not ready, you can be pretty confident that they're not ready. And so you can pass that on to the buyer, say, hey, you need, talk to the loan agent. Yeah, they'll usually say, yeah, they told us we need to do this, that, and the other thing. Another time, the loan agent will tell you that the people are ready to go. But regardless of that, any leads that you generate as buyers, you should have some sort of system that you classify them in. I used to keep paper files. I don't anymore. I do this now on the internet. And I have buyers listed as A, B, C, and D. So what do you think I would consider an A buyer?
Someone ready to buy today.
Pre-approved.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't have a house contingency set or house sale contingency.
Correct. A ready, willing, and able buyer who's able to buy right now. Okay? So these types of buyers, you never have enough of them. Okay? Right now. As an agent, you have to focus on those people like a laser beam. Because if you don't, they're going to slip away because they have a real need. If you're not on top of it, they're going to buy another house. So anyway, that kind of speaks for itself. So obviously they've been pre-approved, as one of you mentioned. And again, now, does that mean they're going to be easy to work with?
No.
No.
No, it doesn't do that. It means they're ready, willing, and able. Being able doesn't mean they're going to buy. Sometimes right in the middle of that transaction or middle of the showing, something comes up in their life and they say, you know what, we're going to wait till next year, okay? It's not about us. And again, when you're a new agent and you need to pay the bills, sometimes when you spend a lot of time with people, it feels like being kicked in the stomach, right? And you're going to get that feeling. And it's going to happen. Unfortunately, you need to brush that off and move on to the next thing, because that's going to happen throughout your career. It happens to me now. If I have transactions that I work on and it's not about me and something falls through. So then you go to your B buyers. What would you consider a B buyer? Still pretty good because I put it close to A, right?
Sure, someone who's gonna buy in the next 3 months or so?
Possibly.
Someone who's, I don't know, is we still going pre-approved at that point?
I would assume a B buyer is somebody that's qualified at least. They may need to get pre-approved, and that might be what is keeping them from becoming an A buyer. Sure. So, but to put it in a little simple terms, they're really close to being an A buyer, but there's some sort of event that needs to take place in order for them to be moved into that A category. For example, they've called you, they want to move to Boise, but it's still hinging on a job interview that they did. Okay? So now, if they're already living here, are you going to want to show that person houses?
No.
No, exactly. Why would you be spending your time with somebody who can't pull the trigger? Now, there are no rules in this business, there are exceptions. I'll give you a good exception to that rule. Let's suppose you get a buyer lead and they're moving here from Oregon and they want to come and see the different neighborhoods, but they're not going to be ready to buy till spring. Okay? I hate getting those calls. All right? But then I have to decide, do I want to work with this buyer or not? And again, you're building your career, so you're probably going to. And so then you're going to be spending time with somebody that you can't pull the trigger. And if that's the case, then I would definitely ask for you to get a buyer representation agreement signed for the future. And they should understand that. You're going to be spending your time, your energy. You're basically playing tour guide for a day or half a day, whatever it is. And if you do enough of those and you don't get paid, that lost time and revenue, money, gas, it adds up. So you don't want to be spending your time with buyers who are not ready to pull the trigger. I'm only saying that there are occasionally exceptions. I just did it recently with an investor client who was referred to me by a mega property owner in California who I used to do business with. And so I knew it was a solid gold lead. And they wanted to come to Boise to look for the different areas so they could decide where they wanted to buy apartment buildings, okay? Now again, I wasn't thrilled with the fact that I'm gonna be spending my day and not writing offers at the end of the day, okay? But it did end up being a large sale 6 months later. So it paid off. But you have to make those judgments each time as an agent. But again, you're a B buyer, has some sort of event. There's other things too. You mentioned possible sale of a house. We're going to talk about this in trade ups and trade downs in different markets, whether you should list first or buy first if you're a trade up or trade down client. But we're not talking about that today. But again, it might be a case of their house isn't ready to go on the market and they're in a marketplace where that house really needs to be on the market in order for anyone to take their offer seriously. So that might be what's keeping them. They're a B buyer, they're very well qualified, but they're not quite an A. And you're going to spend some time with those people. Now you're C people. When I go into C, that usually means that they have credit issues, or they're not super motivated, or I often put investor clients in this category. Not all investor clients, but I put some of them in that category. Because some of them have very unrealistic expectations. And some of them, when they explain to you what they're looking for, I would buy it. But do I throw away their names? No, I keep them in my C category because you just never know. And then I've been criticized many times by these type of investors. You realtors, you buy all the good deals. And I would say, yeah, I do that sometimes, but Mr. Investor or Mrs. Investor, when I was a new agent and I had no money, I used to have people like you in my database. No, I don't say this to them. But this is what I'm thinking. I had people like you in my database, and you wanted a house 30% below market, and then I would find one, and then I would call you, and you would tell me you were busy. So what did I do when I started having money? I started calling you, and then when you didn't pick up, I bought it myself. Then I just stopped calling you. But C buyers, again, it's your army, the people in your sphere of influence. You never know when that person, you team up with that person, or they throw you a deal, or they want you to list a property that they turned, that they fixed up. So all those relationships are valuable, but they may not be your motivated buyer. Now, when is an investor a motivated buyer?
When they just bought a house?
Well, sometimes they're just eager to fill their portfolio and they're willing to pay retail price for a property. There are those type of investors, long-term investors, but investors who are in a 1031 exchange. So this isn't a tax class. I'm not going to give a bunch of tax advice here, but when you hear that, they've got a window to work in. Now, does that always mean that they're just going to go jump on some property? No, they're usually pretty savvy, and they're looking for something in particular. And just because they have a tax consequence doesn't necessarily mean they're going to effect that exchange. If they don't find a property, sometimes they will turn around and pay the taxes. Because if there's no worthy investment, sometimes that is the right decision to make. However, a lot of times in those cases, that's not their goal. They do want to buy, so suddenly they are an A buyer. And so you move them up to that. Another thing about new agents and investors that I kind of want to warn about, investors are very, very good sometimes at taking advantage of new agents. One, they know you'll work hard for them. They know that you'll run around and beat the bushes. They know, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but they know that they can get you to write ridiculous offers that some experienced agent might pass on. And so, do you have to work with any client that comes along?
No.
Absolutely not. But I'll give you an example of exactly the scenario you're talking about. In San Francisco, there was a lady who was actually almost a celebrity because she had been restoring Victorian houses all over San Francisco. And I happened to meet this lady, and she's very educated in real estate, knew a lot more about it than I did at the time, but she right away put me to work because I didn't know at the time. She did that with every realtor she met. because she knew the simple formula that the more sets of eyes that are running around, the more likely she's going to find something she can make money on, right? So I didn't really I'd get excited at first because I'd find a property, and the first thing she'd say was, "We'll start writing an offer." And she'd always seem to write an offer for exactly what it would take to not have the deal go through. It was always that number where she would make money, of course, and she's doing this to make a living. She's not doing anything wrong here, but I was writing offers like crazy. And then, like the listing presentations I mentioned I was doing in lesson 1, where I kept going and going and going and wasn't successful, well, this was a similar pattern, because I was writing offer after offer after offer, and I was getting really good at writing offers, because she wouldn't pass on anything. She just take a look at it and say, "It's worth $1 million, I'll pay $750 for it." So one day, the person who was the broker in the commercial department in my office would overhear me on the phone working, and he comes over to my desk and he's silent and goes, "Hey Kevin," he says, "when you find a property that she's gonna buy, let me know, because I'll buy it and you can have the commission." And that kind of woke me up, right? And that's just a lesson, investors might work you to death, but they're no different than any other buyer. If they're not a path to an escrow, I tell you right now, I'd much rather have a young couple who just repaired their credit, and it's been their dream to not be tenants the rest of their life, and they've been working on this goal for years, and then you meet them at the right time where they're ready to pull the trigger, and they're grateful for everything that you do to help them get into a house. If I look throughout my career, those were the best clients to have and the most rewarding, and they're the ones that usually would refer 4 or 5 of their friends to me later. And so I've made a lot of money from investors over the years, but they're not the end all in this and begin all in this business. So now D buyers. A D buyer is someone who you meet, you sit down with, maybe you do a prior buyer presentation, and you say to yourself, there's absolutely hardly any way that this person is ever going to buy a house. But why would I keep a file on them?
Because there's always that day.
Partly because it's another person in my army. I didn't reject the person. I sat down, I spent time with that person. I told them what they may or may not need to do to buy a house. Now, I've had people like that in my database. Very seldom did they amount to a transaction. But one thing that they did do, because I treated them with the utmost respect, some of them referred to me, some of their friends that were A buyers. And so they're people that are in your farm, that are in your army. And I'll give you one example where and I won't spend a lot of time on this because you might never have this happen, to a D buyer. At one point in time, back in California, I was president of a rod and gun club. Believe it or not, there was a gun club in San Francisco. That's a fact. I was the president at one time. And we had a caretaker, and his name was Danny. And this wasn't a high-paying job. It wasn't a super involved job. Danny got to live in a free house on the premises because our lease with the city required somebody to live in the building. So that was basically Danny's job description, was he lived in a building. I think he emptied the trash cans out once in a while. But we had to have somebody on the premises. It was Danny. Danny used to always joke with me that one of these days he's going to buy a house for me. And even he thought it was a joke, because Danny made about $500 a month in San Francisco. So if you know the prices there, doesn't get you much. $1 million doesn't get you much. So, and again, I'm not putting down Danny. Danny was a great guy. Danny had issues. We used to have to bail him out of jail about once every 3 months. But that's why he had this job. So one day, I show up doing gun club business in between all my other business stuff I was doing, and somebody says, "Hey, Danny's been asking to talk to you all morning." And I'm like, okay, fine, I'll talk to Danny. And I go down and talk to Danny. Danny's got a great big pile of paperwork that came in the mail. He couldn't make heads or tails of it. And so I'm spilling this stuff all over his messy house, the caretaker house, and turned out that he had an aunt who owned a bunch of land out in the desert, and she left it to Danny, and Danny never knew heads or tails of this lady. But this lady Danny was her only heir, and he was left a whole bunch of desert property. I usually wouldn't go out of our market to sell property, but I went, and it turned out I used it as an excuse to take a road trip, and I drove out to Ridgecrest, California, and went out into the desert, and I went out into the sagebrush, and I found this acreage. It was 160 acres of sagebrush with no water on it, and it was close to Ridgecrest, but it was probably going to take about another 50 years for the city limits to reach this land. But I found out something interesting while I was down there. It was covered with desert tortoises. And it turned out that a bunch of people wanted this land set aside for desert tortoise habitat. So again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because you're never going to have a sale like this. I sold the land to a nature group. Well, I represented Danny in the sale of it, and Danny bought a condo. So that's probably the only D buyer, but we won't spend any more time on that because you're not going to meet many Dannys with heirs they weren't aware of. So, but don't rule it out. If you base your career on it, you're definitely done. So it isn't so unusual today, but it was kind of unusual when I started for agents to spend as much time preparing for a buyer presentation as they would a listing presentation. But at a certain point in my career, I learned that that was very valuable. Now again, I became a strong listing agent and I could be kind of picky about the buyers I worked with. So what I devised for myself, sure that I learned it from someone else, but I certainly modified it to my own liking, a buyer presentation that I would do whenever I got a call. So when I got a buyer call, and I would listen to little tidbits over the phone, listening to them carefully what they have to say, and determine if that was somebody that I thought might be a good prospect. And then I would invite them to come to my office and sit down and do a presentation, where I tell them that I'm going to walk through every step of the buying process ahead of time. Now, a lot of people would say they were too busy to do this. That's fine, because I had enough buyer leads. Because the people who did have the time to come in, they immediately moved up that ABCD chart just by the fact that they were motivated to meet with me. Now, before the meeting, I didn't care if they're pre-approved. I would if I was showing a house. But I also was just more interested in, am I going to be able to connect with these people and put them into contract? Sometimes I could figure that out over a short phone conversation. But I definitely could figure that out if they were willing to come in and sit down. And again, if they made that effort. Now today, a lot of these are going to be Zoom calls. So they don't necessarily have to be in person. They certainly are better if they're in person. Because again, the amount of effort that they make to meet with you, that they value your time. Now again, they might say, I just want to look at houses. I'd like to see this 3-bedroom, 2-bath house over on Willoughby Street. And I say, well, that's great, but I'm sorry, the way I work is the buyers that I work with, I require them to meet with me for a sit down, and then we both decide whether we can work together. Now, I know your time is very valuable, but what I can promise you is that if you have this sit down with me, it will save you a lot of time in the long run, because I will know a lot more about what you're looking for and what the path is to get you there, and that's going to be the goal of that meeting. And most of the people who are savvy, who listened to what I was saying, they'd show up for that meeting at that time. Now again, it's harder today. You can't do that obviously if you have an out-of-state buyer who's only going to be here to look at houses one day. So there always are exceptions to these things, but most of the time I would do that. Now, that goal, there's several things, but basically anytime you're working with a buyer, it's a funnel concept. Okay? Now, you have area, you have price, and you have house. You need those people to determine what area they want to be in. If they don't know already, I can make a better E than that. Then, of course, they're going to have a certain number of price range, and a certain number of houses are going to be within that price range, but then all the other characteristics that we're going to talk about that meeting about what they're looking for. Now, are you going to work with a buyer who hasn't picked an area yet? When I say work with, I mean, are you going to go out and show them properties? I mean, if their goal is to, I'd like to see houses so I could see, and I would find a very good way to decline that in a positive way. But, by simply saying, look, my time is really important just as yours is, And if you're only driving around, what I can do is I can give you a list of homes in that area of what's for sale, so you can drive around, look at the outside. But if you're only trying to determine if it's the neighborhood you like, then no, it doesn't make sense. And also, we owe it to sellers. I mean, we do not want to be making appointments on sellers' houses when we don't even know if we're going to buy in that particular city. So usually people are accommodating. Some people are not. Some people are very demanding. Now, I compare my system to another system which is called the shotgun approach. And that is, have you ever heard an agent tell you, you know, I pick up the buyers and I show them property, and that way I learn by each house I show them what they're looking for, right? Have you ever heard an agent say that they've shown somebody 20 houses, 30 houses? If I told you that the majority of my career I never showed somebody more than 1 or 2 houses, would you believe me?
No.
Most of the time in my career, I never show more than 1 or 2 houses. Would I show them more? Yes. An A buyer, of course I would. But because I required the buyers to go through this process, not only did I learn enough about them to not waste my time, they also understood the process. See, if a buyer thinks that there's 10 other houses out there, they have to be shown the process you use to eliminate the inventory. You know, for example, you had to have a 3-bedroom, you had to have this, you had to have this, you wanted this neighborhood, it had to be this price. Well, guess what? There's 1 house on the market. Let's go look at it, okay? A lot of times, too, I would go through the buyer presentation, and they might have something realistic. However, at that given time, that particular type of house in that price range didn't exist, but normally would. Like maybe inventory is just down. So maybe there's a house in Carriage Hill, there's nothing right now, but they definitely want that particular subdivision. So there's no reason to show them houses. It's simply a matter of waiting for the right house to come on the market. And I would often tell them, look, there's nothing for sale in that particular sub. I will program it into my computer. Nowadays, people do it themselves, but I will have it so as soon as a house pops up, I will call you immediately. And then a lot of times that sense of urgency is there because they want to be there. There's just that one house, so if it's priced realistically, a lot of times they'd make an offer on it. So a lot of times in my career, now if I was just a buyer's agent, I'd be back at that shotgun approach, because if you're a buyer's agent and you're not showing buyers houses, you're not working, right? Because that shotgun approach that I mentioned, a whole bunch of houses every year are sold that way. In fact, every day they're sold that way. Agent goes and picks them up, they drive them around, they happen to find something, you write an offer on it, great. And we got to talk about normal markets too, because we were in this extremely hot market in our marketplace last year. It's only begun to slow down a little bit recently. Whereas, you know, if you didn't make an offer on day one, you wouldn't be in the bidding process. Those cycles do happen, but marketplaces like that don't last forever. Most of the time, you're going to have a reasonable amount of time to make a decision with your buyer whether to write an offer or not. But that's an ebb and flow kind of thing. So now we're going to talk about the actual buyer presentation. And like I said, it took me a while early on to learn that, you know, we put all this effort into a good, strong listing presentation. Why should we do the same amount of effort into a buyer presentation? If they're a good quality buyer, you're going to get paid the same or more, so they're just as important. And we're going to talk about this also in the listing class, but I want to talk about 2 words, conditions and objections. What do you think the difference is?
Is the conditions of them working with you?
Conditions and objections, when I bring that up as a topic, the reason I bring that up is while you're doing a listing presentation or while you're working with a buyer, it's what should be going on in your head when the buyer's giving you feedback or explaining what they want. The difference between a condition and an objection is objections can be overcome. Conditions cannot. Now, when working with buyers, what's the most common condition you have?
Number of bedrooms.
Limits of their financial ability. So if they've been screened by a good loan agent and their loan amount is absolutely no more than $500,000, their purchase price, then you're not going to want to show them houses above $500,000. So the fact that it's a condition, it's a brick wall, it's something you can't overcome, it's actually not necessarily a bad thing. It actually helps you with the funnel process, because now you've just eliminated every house above that price range. Okay. Now an objection can be overcome. That's something like, they'd really rather have 4 bedrooms, but they could live, they could end up living with 3. that's something that can be overcome if it's the right house. But conditions are not necessarily common, but we run into certain ones, like, for example, let's suppose your buyer's in a wheelchair. You're obviously not gonna take them and show them houses that have an enormous amount of stairs just to get to the front door, right? So that would be a condition that you can't overcome. And there's other ones, but there's not gonna be a lot. There's conditions that come up. Now, back to objections. Again, objections can be overcome, but you don't necessarily have to. And a good example of that is, there's plenty of homes within their conditions that they want, so there's no reason to have to overcome the objections. But let's suppose they tell you, okay, we want a house with a pool, and we want it on 12 acres, and we want a fish pond, and a tennis court and a helicopter pad, and a 5,000 square foot house, and we want it for $350,000. Okay, so now you know that the meeting's basically over. And so as far as these meetings, I held a lot of them, and they would be written into my schedule. And I had one particular one where there was a group of buyers that were investors together, a group of investors, and they were waiting in the conference room. And I was actually busy. I was a little late. I was trying to rush to go in there. And I walk into the conference room, and one of them stands up, and the first thing they tell me is, "We just want you to know that we don't have any money, but we have a lot of enthusiasm." And then I instantly knew that they watched either a late night TV show or they just came from a real estate investment seminar. Anyway, so back to this. So the conditions and objections idea is something that's in the back of your head as they're telling you questions. They're telling you feedback, you're asking questions, and then in your mind, you're trying to determine if that's going to be something you're going to have to overcome or not. And you're going to pay special close to conditions, because conditions are actually sometimes going to make your job a lot easier. The same concept's true on a listing presentation, but we'll talk about that in the next class. So the purpose of this meeting is to, again, build rapport with the client, find out what the client's looking for, put them on the right path, and what I also do is I pre-frame them. We talked about in lesson 1 about deals falling through because of things like inspection issues. One of the things that can cause a deal to fall through is you get a thorough inspection on the property. You haven't really discussed it a lot with the buyer, but then the report that they paid for shows up in their email. They've never read one of these before, and it sounds absolutely atrocious. But when you
Falling
read
apart.
the house is, yes, there's a crack in the tile in the bathroom, and some people that doesn't alarm, but other people it will, and you do not know what is going to cause a buyer who has a lot of remorse. Buyer's remorse is a huge issue, and a lot of times you get an offer accepted, and you got good news. You tell them, hey, your offer got accepted, and the first thing for them is fear of the unknown, right? But if you've had this buyer presentation ahead of time and you discuss that with them ahead of time, it's a lot less likely to happen. So if I'm there in this presentation and I'm with a first-time buyer versus somebody who's bought 10 houses, my approach is obviously going to be very different. But with a first-time buyer, I know that that's a very good chance that might happen when I find them a house. So I talk about it in the buyer presentation. Another thing I talk about again too is the inspection process. Because the one thing you don't want your client to do is sit there and type out a list of the 73 things on that report that they found and then ask the seller to fix it all. Because that's a very good chance your deal will fall through. Now, don't get me wrong, you're an advocate for that buyer. You want to represent them the best you can. I mean, if you find things that are sometimes there's things that do cause you to need to back out of a transaction, okay? The value is no longer there because of the things you discover in that inspection. And again, it's not about you. If you make it about you, it's going to show through to your clients. And sometimes you just have to make that decision. I don't care what your financial situation is. If you drift away to where you're making this transaction about yourself, you've probably got one foot out the door in this business. You have to make it about them. But at the same time, they might actually be wanting to do something that's unreasonable. And so it's not necessarily reasonable that just because some long-term maintenance item is mentioned in that inspection that some seller needs to take care of it. And it also depends what kind of marketplace you're in. How good of an offer did you make on the property? Did you get it for a really low price to begin with, expecting there to be work? All of those things change that dynamic. However, the important point here is if you discuss the inspection process with them ahead of time, it's much less likely to become a problem when the actual inspection comes in later. Same thing's true with appraisal issues, because that's number 2 on what causes deals to fall apart. Now, if an appraisal comes in so low on a property that there's no financial way to bridge the gap between the buyer and the seller, that happens, but most of the time it can be negotiated. But something to prepare your buyer for in a really, really hot market is appraisals often come in low because an appraiser has to go by history. So who do you think knows more about current market value, the appraiser or the real estate agent?
Agent.
And why is that?
Because they're looking at today, not 6 months from now.
Absolutely. You're out there in the trenches, you know what buyers are paying right now. The appraiser has to go by history. They have guidelines they also have to meet that are lender criteria, that are national they have to follow. So often the house is worth more than what the appraisal can bring. The appraiser might even be aware of that, but they may be under restrictions within the appraisal guidelines where they can't bring the value in. Doesn't make them bad people. They're just trying to do their job too. I was in an office meeting where a loan agent was speaking to the office about how now with algorithms, a lot of properties are not requiring appraisals. I had quite a few sales in the last couple of years where the appraisal was waived because either the buyer, I don't know the exact formula, but in my case, the buyers had big down payments and the offers were reasonable. And then when they said that, a bunch of agents in the office cheered at the idea of no appraisals. And I get why they're cheering, but at the same time, I'm thinking, you idiots, don't you realize that we might be next? So anyway, we are facing a lot of things in this industry, and change is constant, and we just have to ebb and flow with it. So back to the buyer presentation. So in that meeting, I've got a goal. And that's to try to show these people one house when they're ready. That really is my goal, okay? I want to turn these people into an A buyer, or I'm going to slip them into my B or C category at the end of the meeting. And to do that, I have to ask questions. So what I would do, and I would have you do this, the title companies provide plenty of these forms, but you can create your own. I created my own, and it's a buyer questionnaire. And that buyer questionnaire is not complicated. It's just financial ability on the top, bedrooms, baths, size of the house, other needs, a room for me to make notes. And I'm basically filling that out like it's an application when they come in for that presentation. But what I want to do is, again, learn as much as I can during that short window. Now, have any of you ever heard the expression, buyers are liars?
Yes.
Yes.
You've heard the expression?
Yes, buyers are liars.
Do you think it's true?
Yes.
I don't think they mean to be liars, but it is true.
Well, I'd say this, that, normal, everybody has a few white lies in their life, or their day, or their week. Some lie more than others. But to believe that, a normal person is going through life and then suddenly they get pre-qualified for a loan, they become extra liars, I don't believe that. Okay, but I do know where the expression comes from. And it actually isn't a negative thing towards the buyers. It's actually usually the agent didn't ask enough questions. And I'll give you a perfect example. You go to work, you're in a real estate office, you're by the water cooler or the coffee pot, and the agent next to you is going, these buyers, they lied to me. I met them at my open house on Saturday. They went out on Sunday and they bought a 2-bedroom house. They told me they wanted a 4-bedroom house. Okay, well, did they lie? No, they probably wanted a 4-bedroom house, but the agent didn't ask them the right questions, right? If the house were to have a view and be close to their employment and had a nice yard or room to expand, et cetera, they'd be willing to buy a 2-bedroom house. So again, these are the types of things that this buyer presentation is to try to avoid. So in there, again, question on baths. Now, when I say bedrooms, how many bedrooms does somebody need? I'm trying to determine if it's a condition or an objection, okay? So it may sound silly, but when they say we'd like a 3-bedroom, I ask them, why do you need a 3-bedroom? And they may tell you, well, I work at home, I need an office. And we just have the one child, and of course we need a master bedroom. Okay, it makes sense, right? So if a room were 2-bedroom, but it had an extra room for your office, would that also work? Because you just might have opened up the door to some other houses otherwise. Okay? You don't necessarily want to expand the search. Your job is to narrow it, but you also want to serve the client the best you can. So knowing why they need a 3-bedroom is really, really important. I used to sell these custom homes on the coast. Every one of them had 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths. I sold every one of them to a couple. And they'd just tell you, like, you're buying a 4-bedroom house. Well, if we ever resell it, we want it to be able to, for a family to buy it. Now, that makes sense, except they never got any cheaper, and families never could afford these houses. So every one of them's a couple. I would say, too, if it was just the man deciding, you would have a bedroom and a bath and a walk, and you'd have a 5,000-foot garage. So that's why you don't always listen to them. Now, here's another little tidbit, too. When you have one of these, it's the same thing as showing properties. If you're doing a buyer presentation, you want all the buyers to be there. Having just one show up is what we call pitching a one-legger. Now, they will tell you, well, look, my wife is really busy, and I've got more time to look. So when they tell you this, they're wrong. Okay? You want to try to have all of the decision makers that are showing. You want to have them all at a listing presentation. You want to have them all at a buyer's presentation. Again, there are exceptions to this rule. There are certain types of situations where, my wife's in Iraq serving in the military, okay, but we want to buy a house before she comes home, okay? So there's a scenario where you're going to break that rule, but generally you don't want to pitch a one-legger. So then again, I don't need to go through all these questions. I used to joke around. So what about a kitchen? Do you want a kitchen? That's not really what I want to know. Of course they want a kitchen. What I want to know is, do they actually cook a lot? Are they hobby cookers? Are they a chef? You probably already know what line of work they're in, but if they cook a lot at home, then the way that kitchen's laid out is going to be probably really important. They're probably going to want a really nice kitchen. If there are people that work 12 hours a day and they live off Uber Eats and order pizzas, then maybe the kitchen's not going to be that big of a deal. Okay, again, it's learning, narrowing down priorities. And I go through the entire list like that. It's the same thing with a garage, They want a 3-car garage, but you want to know, does it absolutely have to be a 3-car garage? Is there a really good reason for that? And if there is, and it's within their price range, you don't want to deviate from it. Again, you don't want to have to spend time trying to overcome something that isn't necessary to overcome. But let's suppose that we're at the limit of their price range and they want all these other things, and if you start adding 4-car garages, etc., it's going to push them out of that price range. Then you might have to overcome some of these objections. So now a lot of times, after you end up with all those questions, you funneled down area, you've talked, you already know the price range, but now you're in this meeting talking about the house. There's a question at the end that I would often ask, and this is something I added. After going through all these things, I go down the list. So you definitely need a 4-bedroom, you definitely need 2 baths, you definitely need this. It's really important to you that the house has a large lot, you like to garden, etc., etc. So let me just ask you a question. And this is a question that helped me not have to show a lot of houses over the years. If the house did not have blank, I wouldn't buy it. Now, some people don't have an answer to that question. Some people will go right back. Well, house has to have a 3-car garage. That's great. Now, again, if somebody tells you they have to have a 3-car garage, that's a condition. Why would you even call them about a 2-car garage house? You wouldn't do that. But sometimes they give you something really specific that's really helpful. And that is, something like, if a house does not have a view of some kind of, the house I grew up in had a view of the ocean, I have to have a view of a lake, I just could not live in a house that didn't have a view like that. Is there a lot of houses like that in any marketplace? Usually not a lot. So guess what that just did? That just made your job a lot easier, right? As long as there's that house within their price range, of course, right? If there isn't and it doesn't exist, then it becomes an objection you have to overcome. But there's another one that's real common. I absolutely have to have a wood-burning fireplace. So if somebody tells you that they, it may not even be a condition, obviously. But again, if they're going to fall in love with a house that has a wood-burning fireplace, why would you waste your time showing them a house that didn't have one? So again, that's how we end up in a situation where we don't have to show the people a lot of houses. So now we're going to talk a little bit about once you get the people in the contract. So you found the house, you make an offer. Now, part of that pre-framing process in that meeting that's very vital and very important is you don't want to be in a situation, especially if you're using the shotgun approach of showing lots of homes, when you get to the point where they're ready to make an offer, and the first thing they want to do is just make a ridiculous offer that you know doesn't have any chance of getting accepted. That's when you're really excited. Oh, great, they love the house. And again, it's your job to put them in that house. Now, getting them to pay more, again, you're an advocate for them. But what if it's the difference between them getting into contract when prices are going up 38% a year like they were last year? By getting them to make the decision to go forward, you may be doing them a huge favor. And if it's been really hard to find a house that fits all their needs, it's really your job to get them into that. Now, there's all kinds of closes to help them with that process once you get there. And you can discuss it with them. One of those things is exactly that. Now, look, you're looking for a home to live in. Now, this may sound crazy to you because it's the biggest investment you've ever made. But the investment side of it isn't what's necessarily most important. Most of us are on this earth less than 100 years, and you're probably going to spend 5 or 10 years of that in that house at least. So if you were to just buy a house based on the fact that it was a good deal, but you were never really happy with it, and you were always thinking ahead to the next house, then you've probably wasted a good chunk of your life. But if you buy a house that you're really happy with it, and here we're only X thousand apart, you're going to be happy for the next 5, 10 years. And that might not necessarily be the exact choice of words, but that's the point that I would try to make. Is $5,000 going to make a difference? When I started selling real estate in San Francisco, there was houses under $200,000 in San Francisco. I used to have buyers back then that would tell me, well, after looking at a few houses, I like my rent-controlled apartment. I think I'm just going to stay. These prices seem too high. The people that bought houses for me early in my real estate career, every one of them is at least a multimillionaire on paper. So did I know that was going to happen? Of course not. But I knew prices would probably go up. You take Idaho, for example. Idaho became a state about 150 years ago. It took 140 years for real estate to get to $100 a foot. It only took a couple more years for it to go to $200 a foot and then $300 a foot. Okay. Now, is that always sustainable? No. It's gonna go up and down. But again, you're trying to help these people make the right decision because being a homeowner versus a renter is important, and what we do is really important. So again, trying to get a buyer to nudge higher on an offer may be the right decision for them. So anyway, but you have to do it in a way that they understand that you're being their advocate, because the minute you lose their trust in this process, you probably lose the client. Now, the goal of that first appointment, that initial here, it wasn't so much in the last state I worked in because people didn't use buyer reps a lot back then. But here they do, and it's a good thing. So the goal of that first meeting is to get a buyer rep signed. That's if it's somebody that you want to be in contract with, of course. You sometimes meet people that you may choose not to. But generally, that's going to be the goal, and then getting them into that house. So here you are. You've shown the property. They want to make an offer, and that's the next step. Now, let's suppose, again, they want to offer less than what you think. So you go over that same scenario. Sometimes you can figure it out for them. Sometimes you get your finance calculator out. Now that app's probably on your phone. You say, look, you're talking about a difference of $7,000. That means X amount per month. And it's usually not a lot. And so we've been looking at, you've looked at X amount of houses, or, we've been waiting for a house to come on the market that had everything that now, does this house have everything you were looking for? And if, the answer is, yeah, then, is it really worth losing this property over $7,000? And again, there's a lot of closes that can work in that scenario, but let's go to the next step. Now, one thing that none of you have to do today is spend time on buyer presentations with the listing agent and the sellers. When I began in real estate, you wrote an offer and you made an appointment to present that offer directly to the sellers with the listing agent present. It's an entire skill set that's getting lost in this industry. Okay, but because so few people do it, now you email an offer over to the listing agent and maybe discuss it on the phone. Now, what advantage did you lose there as an agent?
Personal connection.
the negotiation tactic of why your buyers are better than every other buyer?
I actually knew my offer was presented to the seller. And I could point out any of the nuance, good points, bad points. You could sell them on your client. You didn't have to write these letters, which some places are banning. But it doesn't matter because that's been taken away from us. It's been taken away from us. Started with the fax machine, ended up with email, and basically it's a shame, but at least it saves you the time and energy from having to learn to do that. So now what it becomes is, how good of a presentation and rapport can you get with the listing agent? Because the listing agent is king or queen, and they're the ones that are going to make or break whether you get your offer accepted most likely. And so you do have to build rapport with them. So what is an agent interested in? Usually agents don't like hassles. You want that listing agent to think that you're going to be really easy to deal with. Now for me it's easy. I've been in the business 35 years. I hardly ever have a deal fall apart. I wouldn't be out with these buyers if they weren't real buyers. Okay, you can't do that. So you find other ways to do that, to build rapport. Now the offer might speak for itself. It just may be so much better than the other offers out there, it gets accepted. But another thing, in a multiple offer situation, what are you also trying to do? You're also trying to play detective a little bit with that listing agent. Now a lot of times you can't even get a listing agent to call you. And I think it's a darn shame. I don't negotiate over text. I don't do that with buyers or agents. Sometimes I have absolutely no choice, but I generally do not initiate a negotiation over a text. I want to have a live conversation with that person, and somebody who's a skilled salesperson with years of experience like myself, I'm in a lot more control when I'm having a one-on-one personal conversation with a live person. So the listing agent in this case is no different, because you are, in a sense, selling to the listing agent. The idea of being in contract with my buyers is going to be perfectly smooth. Of course, if it's not, you deal with that and you cross that bridge when it happens. Okay, so let's suppose you get your offer accepted. We already talked about the inspection process. And in the inspection process, you're going to run into hurdles, right? And the best thing to do is to tackle them immediately. The longer you just let something drift along and you don't deal with it, and again, you might be under stress. You might, again, new agent, couple deals might be the difference between you having to go get a part-time job or not. And so you're worried about this, and that causes you to not deal with something immediately. The best thing to do is to tackle that with what's the best interest for your client. Go ahead on, look, I've read the report. I see the fact that there's some electrical wiring that's falling out of place. And, I think that we should definitely get a bid on what it's going to cost to fix that. And then that's the health and safety issue. So I think that's something the seller should take care of, et cetera, et cetera. But you get my drift. The problem is, the solution is usually to deal with it. If you leave something lingering and you let the buyers read that report and a couple of days go by, something might scare them off. So the faster you write that contingency removal and the faster you resolve it. Another thing you want to try to do is avoid having to be a quasi-general contractor. Sometimes you're going to fall into that position, and there's no way out of it because a buyer or just the circumstance requires a bunch of things to be repaired. So now you're either helping pick the vendors or they're finding vendors to repair these items, negotiating between the buyer and seller who's paying for what. Maybe the seller is paying for it all. Regardless, you have to eventually go back to see if that work's completed. Now, are you an expert on electrical? No. Plumbing?
Nope.
I've never had plumber on my business card, ever. So if it's a plumbing issue, I have to ask a plumber. So again, but we still, ride right through these issues. And if the buyer along the way feels like you're the advocate and the seller doesn't think you're trying to nitpick, then usually those deals can be kept together. So now I've had major things wrong with properties and found ways to resolve them. But again, it's a big ethics test. You run into these things, and again, we all get tempted to do the wrong thing. I'll give you an example. I had a very complicated $800,000 sale on an old rental building, and it took a long time to get that to the closing table, and it was scheduled, and we went there for a final walkthrough, and I decided to take a stroll through the backyard, and I'm walking through the grass, and I tripped and fell, and I looked, and what was it? It was a ventilation pipe to an oil tank. And my first thought was, nobody else has seen it. Now, is the cost of removal of those things cheap? It's not. This one was leaking. It required a bunch of soil to go to mix. Of course, I had to disclose it. And the deal fell through. But I had to do the right thing. And that's how we're gonna end this course, really. We get the buyer, we're gonna talk about ethics a little bit at the end, but before I do that, we haven't finished the sale we were talking about. So we get through the inspection process, now we go to appraisals. Now, in a hot market, here's a clause I like to use, and I learned this in the 90s, and the very first time that we were in an offer situation where we got these multiple offers, where people were offering way over the asking price. Now, in that era, I already mentioned, we often did buyer presentations in person. But how are you gonna do that when suddenly you got 30 offers on a house? You're not gonna schedule 30 offer presentations. So we would pick out the best 3, we would do the offer presentations, but again, we had this other problem. People were offering so much over the asking prices that we knew that there was no way for that property to appraise. So how did we get around that situation? The buyer is willing to buy it at that price, but if you wait until the middle of the escrow and you don't discuss the appraisal process, and you get an appraisal that's way off, the likelihood that your deal is going to fall through is a lot higher than if you've already discussed this. And so not only have I discussed this with the buyer ahead of time, that's the potential that could happen in my pre-framing process, I also often wrote into offers, if the buyer was willing, that if the property were not to appraise, buyer to make up the difference in cash. Now, some of you today see that as a common practice. That was not then, but it also caused a whole lot of deals to not fall through. I would do the same thing as a listing agent. If a buyer made an offer on my listing and it was, they're making a really, really high offer, I would put that in the terms. I would just say, hey, could your buyer, are they willing to pay that whether it appraises or not? Now, at the stage where that buyer is trying to get their offer accepted, they're much more likely to agree to it. If you wait till later, they're going to try to negotiate. So now let's suppose you have to negotiate. Let's suppose you have an FHA buyer putting 3.5% down. They've made an offer for $300,000 and the property appraised for $295,000. Okay. Now, the easiest thing would be for the seller to come down $5,000. So you obviously are going to attempt that before you back out of the deal, right? But again, you're not going to just give up. You're going to find out, is there another way for that buyer to come up with that property? Now, on a conventional loan, we used to just order another appraisal. Sometimes you'd get the next appraiser to come in. FHA and VA, that's not going to happen. You have an FHA, VA appraisal, you're stuck with it. So knowing that ahead of time and what flexibility you have with that buyer is really important. So anyway, we get to that stage. Now let's suppose we're closing and we get the closing table. Do you attend the closings with the title company?
I usually do.
Good. I think it's a great practice. Now, do you need to be there?
No.
No.
You
No.
just sit there and twiddle your
Nah,
thumbs.
you're a third wheel. I actually rarely go. If I have somebody that I know I need to hold their hand through the process, I show up. I don't with investor clients. I don't with sophisticated clients. Now, there's a very, very high producing agent in this area that goes to every single closing, and she sells over 100 houses a year. So that's 100 closings. That's a lot of hours. Whenever I try to call this person, she's usually in a closing, okay? But I'm not gonna argue with success because her attitude, and this might be your attitude, is not showing up at the closing, makes them think that you're not really, serious about working with them in the future, and it helps her get future business. And again, I can't argue with success. I just like to hire really good closing people who know their job really, really well, so I could be doing something else that day. Again, unless I feel it's necessary. But again, that's something that's a personal choice of yours, what you decide to do. So I'm going to end the class with just one little thing again about ethics. Every single day that you're a full-time real estate agent dealing with the public, you're going to run into an opportunity to take advantage of someone. And again, most of us are pretty ethical and it's not an issue, but I'll just say the people that don't take those shortcuts are the people that are going to last. If you make this about you in any way, shape, or form, the customers are going to see through it, and your career is going to be pretty short. Anyway, that's all for today. The next lesson is going to be on the listing presentation.